All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Trying the Power. So I wanted to make a video about the evolution of bodybuilding. So these photos that you're looking at right here, these are from a comedy show. It was filmed about 10 years ago, so in 2007 probably, right around that time. So I'm showing these pictures because basically what they are is one of the comedy actors in that show is basically just a really fat guy, and they put a muscle suit over top of his big giant stomach. And essentially when they did that, it made it look exactly like the bodybuilders today that have the bubble gut when they go on stage. So it just really illustrated to me the fact that these guys, this was kind of before the bubble gut era, really. In the early 2000s, you had Ronnie Coleman and Jay Cutler and Marcus Rule, and those were some of the guys that probably had the bigger, blockier guts, but still nothing too crazy in terms of a ridiculous bubble gut on stage or in the off season. Marcus Rule probably being the most crazy example from that era. So really this TV show, although it was just making fun of bodybuilders, it really kind of predicted the future of the sport, because in their little skit, like I said, they were making fun of bodybuilding and what bodybuilders look like to them. Little did they know, the big fat guy they put a muscle suit on over top of his fat stomach would actually look like a real bodybuilder a couple years down the line. I'm sure when they were filming that skit, they intended the fat guy to look absolutely ridiculous with the muscle suit on and not to look like a realistic bodybuilder. And the other guy they had in the skit actually looked kind of realistic, the muscle suit that he had on. So I'm sure when they filmed it, they weren't expecting that the fat guy was going to look like an actual bodybuilder. They wanted him to look ridiculous and stupid. And now here we are in the future. We have amateurs that have the bubble gut looking like that, if not worse. We've got pros with the bubble gut like that. We've got Mr. Olympias that get on stage, runner-ups at the Mr. Olympia, top 3 at the Mr. Olympia that all have this bubble gut thing going on. So that's where bodybuilding's at today, and this show pretty much accurately predicted it. However, I do think there is hope for bodybuilding in the future, so I wanted to start out by going back to the very first bodybuilding competition ever and go over the course of bodybuilding history and kind of talk about the evolution of the physiques that we see in bodybuilding from, the first competition to what we see today to what I think we're going to see in the future. So I'm sure a lot of you guys know who Eugene Sandow was. He was a famous strongman and bodybuilder from, the early 1900s, late 1800s. And this is the guy that the Mr. Olympia trophy is molded after. So the reason that the Sandow Trophy is modeled after Eugene is the fact that he organized the very first bodybuilding competition. It was called the Great Competition, and it was held on September 14th, 1901. So again, it was held in September, which is around the same time they hold the Olympia. So that's a pretty interesting coincidence there. They probably planned that out. So in that first competition, pretty much the early days, it was pretty much anybody with any degree of musculature that really looked anything above average would be considered a bodybuilder. I'm sure some of those guys were just guys that didn't even lift, and they were guys that just, were farm boys or worked in a factory or worked lifting heavy objects at work, maybe in construction or something. And they felt that they had a little bit more muscular body than a typical guy. So those physiques were just kind of the beginning stages of what the standard would be for bodybuilding. So I think the real standard started to be set about, 40 years later when the AAU started the Mr. America competition. So the Mr. America competition predates the Mr. Universe and predates the Mr. Olympia. So this was really one of the first major bodybuilding titles that really said, okay, if you win the Mr. America, this is kind of like the golden standard for a bodybuilding physique. This is one of the biggest titles you can win, and this is one of the most prestigious shows that you can compete in. So the Mr. America began in 1939, and some of the early winners that you guys might know, John Grimek won in 1940 and 1941, and John Grimek was also the first Mr. Universe champion in 1948. So if we look at John Grimek's physique, this is kind of a good idea of kind of the early standards of what the bodybuilding physique was expected to look like in the 30s and the 40s. So John Grimek was kind of the golden standard of one of the first really good physiques, and he kind of had that classic bodybuilding look, but just a little bit smaller. So when the Mr. Universe competition began in 48, that kind of ushered in a new era of bodybuilding physiques. You had Steve Reeves, who won the Mr. Universe in 1950. Then 1950 through 1960, I feel like there was a lot of growth and a lot of changes in the size of the physiques during that era, because I think the 60s is when bodybuilding really became, a very competitive sport, and the physiques were getting bigger. the muscular development was getting better, and you had bigger guys winning. So you also had Bill Pearl. He won the amateur Mr. Universe in 1953. You had Mickey Hargitay, who I made a video about as well. He is actually Mariska Hargitay's father, so that's the girl from Law and Order. I made a video about that. Then, of course, you had Reg Park as well, one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's idols, who won the universe in the 50s as well. So then 1960s, those would come along, and that would kind of usher in a new era of bodybuilding. So the physique standard, the bar had just been raised in 1960. So in 1967, Arnold Schwarzenegger won his very first Mr. Universe competition. And when Arnold came to the scene, this was ushering in a new era, the era of the classic physique. So, of course, in 1965, that's when the Mr. Universe competition started. And, of course, you had Larry Scott win that. And in my opinion, at the time, Larry Scott's muscular development was way ahead of many of the bodybuilders from that era in the early 60s. I mean, just the size of his arms and just his overall development, I think Larry Scott helped usher in that new era that Arnold really solidified in 1967. So from that point forward, you kind of had the Mr. Olympia and the Mr. Universe going head-to-head for being the really most prestigious title in bodybuilding. Then you had Mr. America kind of slip into that third place spot, although it was still a very prestigious title to win. So, of course, after Larry Scott, you had Sergio Oliva winning the Olympia. Then the era of Arnold would come in 1970, and that would be when he won 6 of his 7 Olympias. He would come back in 1980 and win another one. So obviously, as many of you know, the 70s were very dominated by the classic physique look. Arnold dominated the first portion of the 70s. You had Franco Columbo in 1976. Then you had Frank Zane dominate from 77 to 79. Then, of course, Arnold came back and won in 1980. So the 70s were all about the classic physique. Frank Zane, Arnold, Franco Columbo. Very classic era in the 70s. Then the 80s would be the early 80s was kind of a confusion of what the standard was. So the standard was kind of being reset in the early 1980s. So you had Franco win in 1981. You had Chris Dickerson win in 1982. And you had Samir Bannout win in 1983. And in my opinion, these are 3 very different physiques winning the Olympia. So I think the judges were kind of trying to decide what the new standard was. Then in 84, the era of Lee Haney would begin. So I would say Lee Haney was kind of a cross between that classic physique and I don't want to say a mass monster, but he had a lot more size than, the classic guys were used to. So I think Lee Haney's era kind of ushered in a mix between classic physique and kind of that mass monster look because he was a pretty big bodybuilder. So he kind of put his foot in the door for opening up the mass monster era, which began in 1992 with Dorian Yates. So in my opinion, obviously Dorian Yates kind of ushered in the era of the mass monster, but really, I don't really think he had that big of an issue with a bubble gut per se. I mean, his waist was definitely thicker and blockier than we were really used to, obviously coming out of the classic physique era, but still, I wouldn't really call it a bubble gut. It wasn't very aesthetic, but he had so much mass just all over his frame, all over his physique, that it didn't really make the gut stand out as bad. Because what we see with the bubble gut today is the Palumboism version of the bubble gut, where the guys have smaller limbs and the rest of their body seems small in comparison to their gut. Then we had guys like Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, where although their gut may have been bigger, it may have been blockier, it may have been thicker, these guys had so much muscle mass on their body, it didn't make it look like an issue of Palumboism. Maybe later on in Ronnie's career, it kind of started to look like that, and that's kind of where the Palumboism era started. And I would kind of agree with that because I think the whole Palumboism bubble gut thing really started in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So there's really only 2 main guys that had this issue, so it wasn't very prominent, and both of these guys were kind of known for being freaks. So you had, obviously, Dave Palumbo, who actually never turned pro. Then you had Greg Kovacs, who is the proclaimed biggest bodybuilder of all time. And a lot of people say that Greg was one of the first to really exhibit really bad Palumboism and a horrible, unsightly gut on stage. But really they were seen as freaks, and it wasn't really seen as a common thing at the time like it is now. So Greg Kovacs, obviously 400 plus pounds in the off season, high 300s, if not 400 pounds on stage. And towards the end of his career, it just looked absolutely horrible. His stomach was huge. His arms were small. His conditioning was bad. And it was just a mess towards the end of Greg Kovacs' career. And I think that really started to usher in the era of these guys trying to get way too big that we see today. So fast forward to present day, maybe a couple of years ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger made his little controversial statement about guys competing in the Arnold with bubble guts and how he did not like the fact that they couldn't control their gut. And he really spoke his opposition to the whole thing. And that kind of started with, I hate to point people out, but it kind of started with Rolly Winkler. That's one of the reasons that came up. Ben Pekulski, who has done a few Arnold Classics. There's a few viral photos of Ben where he's backstage and his gut kind of looks really bad, and people have captioned it, like he's pregnant, he looks like an alien, stuff like that. So I think Ben Pekulski is another example of where the bubble gut thing started to get out of hand. Obviously, you had Kai Green. Although he's been able to control it a little bit better in recent years, there were some points where it looked pretty bad on Kai Green. Obviously, there were some years where Phil Heath had it. Even Sean Roden, his gut was starting to lose control of it a little bit, but I wouldn't yet call it a bubble gut. And then, of course, if you look through the amateur ranks, there's plenty of examples of guys that have, horrible looking physiques and horrible instances of kind of a Palumboism type of bubble gut. So all these guys trying to get too big too fast, and it's happening to a lot of guys nowadays. But now, fortunately, I think this whole advent of the classic physique division is going to save bodybuilding. So I think the future of bodybuilding is actually very bright. And I think, initially when they introduced men's physique, I was a little bit skeptical of them doing this, but really I think it did kind of bring to light the fact that, first of all, there will be interest in people watching these shows. Although personally, I'm not very interested in men's physique. When men's physique came along, it did prove that people would show up and watch these shows of these smaller guys, even though they're not the big freaks. And I think that kind of opened the door to introducing the classic physique division. So here's what I think, in my opinion. I think basically we have reached the climax of the size of these bubble guts, of the bad conditioning, the Palumboism, all that stuff. I think we've reached the highest point of critical mass. So I think we have too many. We have as many as there should be, and it's going to be, only less and less from this point forward. So I think classic physique is going to be the new ideal that people are chasing, because throughout the early 2000s up until present day, I think people were starting to chase that mass monster look, and the only goal that people had in mind was just build muscle. Get as big as possible. If you want to be a bodybuilder, you just have to be big, and that's just it. But now you have the aesthetic era with YouTube and, guys like Ziz. I know a lot of people hate him, but the whole YouTube thing with all these guys, Matt Ogus, you have Jeff Seid, and some of these other guys have really popularized the aesthetic side of things. And now you have the introduction of classic physique, where people can actually become a pro and compete in this weight class, and I think it goes by weight and height, and now people can compete in that and not have to build all this muscle. So it's opened the door for a lot of people who don't want to, take all the drugs, who don't want to ruin their body, who don't want to get too big. So it's opened the door for a lot of people who don't want to really abuse that side of bodybuilding. So I think that's really going to be an entire game changer for the whole IFBB, and I think it's really going to open a lot of doors for a lot of good physiques to come through the cracks. So in my opinion, over the next 10 years, we're always going to have our mass monsters. We're always going to have our freaks, because everyone's always going to want to go see the freak show at the Olympia, and they're going to want to see the big, freaky, gigantic guys, and that's always going to be a thing. But I think now, over the next 10 years, the average physique, or the bulk of the physiques that we see turning pro, coming through the NPC, rising up the ranks, I think we're going to be seeing people focus a lot more on bringing a smaller, tighter, well-conditioned, well-balanced, well-proportioned physique, and we're going to see less and less of these guys coming through the NPC that are trying to be way too big and way bigger than they need to be. So I think that's the future of bodybuilding, is classic physique. I think it will save it, and it will create a new ideal, at least for the next decade or so. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick, strength and power.